Hi everyone. So we're in week 7, and this week we're dealing with the twin concepts of calling and commitment. I think it's hard to make the case for anything other than these two ideas being twin concepts or two sides of the same coin. I'm not really sure one can have a commitment to something without feeling some sense of calling inside about it, or whether someone can, I guess maybe you could say that they wouldn't be called to that particular thing. Maybe it's picking up trash on Saturdays with their scout troop, right? But they feel a sense of calling and ownership of the scouts, and this is what the scouts are doing, so this is what they're doing. So I think the idea of commitment and calling, I think they go together. I think most of us would agree to that, but maybe the case can be made differently, and I'm open to hearing that case. So again, these two ideas going together. So let's talk about calling for a moment in this introduction. Calling, we get our word vocation from the Latin word vocare, which has to do with calling. And really, in the Roman Catholic tradition, there is a really highly developed idea about vocation, that it has to do with that sense of voicing of call. It's not simply what one does for work. Work is an outgrowth of vocare, or of calling. Work is an outgrowth of that sense that one's put on the planet to do a certain thing. So with that, we can say vocation is more than work. Now, that's true in any number of fields, and some of those fields we feel like are more naturally given to that. And sometimes we have jobs, whether it's in college or we're restarting, or we're picking up extra money, delivering pizzas, make sure the kids have shoes, whatever it is. I mean, there are some things that we do that we would not say this particular job is my calling, but there's some higher purpose that is the calling, and we do what we do for the sake of that higher calling. Now, when you are teaching like I am, or nursing, or working in criminal justice, or some of these other fields, we find that there's a really, there's kind of a one-to-one correspondence. So there's a real intricate connection between the sense of calling and vocation. The two are going hand in hand. And I think that's what most of us would want for the kind of work that we do, right? We would want to be able to say, this thing that I'm doing is something that expresses who I am and what I feel like I'm put on the earth to do. Making pizzas, isn't it? Of course, maybe for the founder of Pizza Hut, right? Maybe making pizzas was their life's ambition and dream and sense of calling, providing something good to eat. Now, we can debate whether you think Pizza Hut pizza is good pizza or not. That's not my point. My point is, for some, making pizza, for some, making socks. My mother was a tailor, and she considered what she did as a tailor to be an expression of self, an expression of her relationship with God and what she felt God wanted her to do. So now, when we talk then about this issue of calling, there are certain understandings, maybe assumptions that I would make and others would make about this sense of calling. So I'm going to talk about 3 of those here in this introduction. Assumption number 1, there is a caller, right? It's difficult for me to think about this in any way other than God. When we say that I have a calling, well, that has to come from somewhere, right? And if there is not a personal God that is issuing said call, then where would that sense come from? The universe, simply as a collection of matter, cannot issue a call. There has to be, in my view, and I think one would be hard-pressed to make the case in any other way, that there is not only a God, but there's a personal God who is making that calling. A personal God who is not like the deist, who have kind of said that God sets everything in motion and then steps back, removes himself, and just allows the world to go spinning on its axis and the universe to be without any kind of interference. No, a sense of calling says, to me, that there's a personal God who looks at the individual and says, or determines beforehand. We could debate that, right? But there's a personal God who looks at that individual and ordains, if you will, to use some pretty religious language, that particular person to do a particular thing at a particular time and place. So that's assumption or understanding number one, that there's not only a God, but there's a personal God behind this sense of calling. Assumption number two is there is a called, right? So there's a caller and there is a called one. We humans are the called ones. And we, like God, and then we could go into this whole conversation that I think we've had a little bit before about the image of God in the human person. But we are personal beings. A personal God speaks in some way, shape, or form to personal beings. And then that issues forth in a response from the individual. Maybe you say, I don't like the thing that I was called to do. I know I'm supposed to do X, but I really don't want to do X. I want to do Y. Then you have all kinds of other conversations about how one responds to God's will if one knows what God's will is for one's life. I feel like I'm doing what God put me on the planet to do, but also that resonates with who I am as an individual, and I say, yes, Lord, I want to do that. So assumption or understanding number three. Number one, there's a caller. Number two, there's a called one. Number three, the will is involved, and that's kind of what I was just starting to allude to. There's God's will, there's the human will, and then there's the way that those two forces, if you will, no pun intended, cooperate. How that happens. And of course there's a lot of theological discussion about that I'm not going to get into right now. But let me just say that when it comes to this idea of calling, I think there are these three assumptions happening. Otherwise, I'm not sure that the word, vocation in that Latin sense or in that sense of calling, I'm not sure the word has any force of meaning, right? If there's not a personal God and a personal human being responding to that call. So, having said that, let's talk for a moment about commitment and what I think I can demonstrate from the scriptures as we talk about this, because calling is easy to talk about in the scriptures. But I don't think calling is enough. There are times of adversity that invariably set in our lives, and commitment is what is demonstrated in those periods. It's easy to be committed to something when it's going well, and in fact, I might even contend that that's not commitment. I might contend that is just benefit. Commitment is demonstrated when things are tough, when there's adversity. Commitment as a parent is demonstrated when things are difficult. It's not just when the children are asleep and everything is peaceful. It's not Christmas morning. It's not that kind of thing, although Christmas morning at our house, what am I saying? That was always craziness. But commitment is something that transcends just calling. Commitment is that cooperation of the will to say, not only, yes, I agree that this is my calling, but I'm going to stick it out. And commitment is needed to follow through on anything. I remember when I was about a 9 or 10-year-old, my mother, I said something, I was going to do something, some great plan for something, and she said, well, talk is cheap. Well, at 9 or 10, I was a very literal thinker, and I remember pondering that. What does that mean, talk is cheap? Well, now I'm an adult, of course, I know, right? We have to go beyond what we say and actually do it. And it's in the doing of things that things get, when the calling is demonstrated in some ways, when the commitment is demonstrated. I am going to do it no matter what. I think commitment says I'm going to pursue this course of action until either there is no more course of action to pursue or there's no more of me. That to me is what commitment is. Putting it all on the line. And I think many of you have put it all on the line by going back to school at this time and in this situation in your lives. Okay, so we'll come back and we'll talk about a few passages from the New Testament and how this plays out.